Chernobyl, the most historic nuclear event of mankind. It all happened because of a human error and multiple safety checks skipped or unnoted. As a result, it exploded, leading to an unexpected catastrophe. Our expedition began in Pripyat, the town built to serve the reactor at Chernobyl. We were introduced to this through our anchor text, A Life on Our Planet, by Sir David Attenborough. The consequence of the nuclear reactor's explosion was thousands of tragic deaths and many more jaw-dropping injuries. However, there are shockingly many beautiful positives to this awful situation. The surrounding wild spaces of Chernobyl began to thrive and rewild themselves back to sustainable levels. The zone is now flourishing without burden of human activity and is expected to carry on within the next 20,000 years, until we return.
Many of those that were killed by the disaster at Chernobyl became sick due to radiation poisoning, damaging their cells. Our immersion also took us inside the cell and back through our shared heritage. Mitochondria are organelles inside cells. A special thing about mitochondria is that they carry out respiration, which is how we release energy stored in our food. This is the reason our cells are alive. This is the reason we are alive. Mitochondria are also special because they contain DNA, but only DNA from our birth mothers. By analyzing our mitochondrial DNA, scientists found out about a woman from around 200,000 years ago. We have named her Eve, mitochondrial Eve. Mitochondrial Eve is all our biological grandmothers. Let that sink in. We are all descended from just one lady. Her DNA is in all of our bodies. Take any two people on the planet, and the furthest you need to go back is around 7,075 generations. And we have the same grandmother. It may sound impossible, but it all adds up. All humans share a common ancestor.
Building on this, we learned about the Tree of Life and how we share a common ancestor, not just with every human, but with every species. When looking at the Tree of Life, we noticed that all of life is in some way connected. We use the Tree of Life to see how chimpanzees are so similar to us. This is because we came from common ancestors that lived about 5 billion years ago. Some people say that we evolved from chimps, but this is actually wrong, as we evolved from a group of African apes that broke into different evolutionary paths, one which became chimps and one which became we, humans. We also learned that we are closely related to plants too. If you look at a plant cell next to an animal cell, there are more similarities than differences. The Tree of Life showed us that if you go back 2.1 billion years ago, we share a common ancestor with all plants. In fact, all life on Earth is related. This is an amazing thought. We are cousins with all of creation.
For our immersion, we also studied cave art. There are a lot of skills needed for this task, like finding the underlying geometry of the fauna that we were assigned. The underlying geometry of a shape is the basic shapes you picture when studying the animal. Our prehistoric ancestors painted these animals on their cave walls as they worked with nature, not against it. They also had some animal gods, showing that, to them, animals were extraordinary species. Those people, our ancestors, understood that they were a part of nature too. We decided this was important, so we sketched and tried to emulate this cave art. For example, I drew a wild horse after looking at examples. After, we did a strong coloured outline and signed our work as they used to, using our hands.
For this expedition, our guiding question was, what is our relationship with the natural world? When I first heard this guiding question, one of my first initial thoughts was, how do we link with nature? I thought this because in the guiding question, how it says relationships with the natural world, made me think about how much, if anything in the modern world, we have to do with nature and what does this look like. For me, there were so many other species. I had the idea that we were somehow separate and wanted to know more about how we were connected after getting just a glimpse from the Tree of Life. Another wonder that I also had was, how are we so reliant on nature if we're not a part of it? This links to case study 1. I wondered, especially when thinking of the cave art, how could nature be so inspiring to us in one way but also really dangerous in another?
In case study 1, we studied why it is important not to think of humans as being separated from nature, and how humans have always been inspired by it. To help us with this, we looked at evidence that shows why humans are part of nature. We looked at cells to an organ systems and saw how this organisation is not special to humans. We also looked at rainforest biomes and the Maya rainforest people, who seemed to understand very well just how closely related to nature they were. We also used the text The Lost Words to think about how in the modern world people are spending more time away from nature and thought about how dangerous a trend this is.
To start case study 1, we studied cells by preparing microscope slides with samples from an onion. To prepare the onion slide, we took a thin layer of the onion, which is called the epidermis, and placed it onto the slide. Then we stained the sample with iodine to make the tiny organelles inside the cells more visible. We then placed the cover slip on top of the onion slide and brought it into focus by moving the object lens on the microscope. We then looked through the eyepiece lens. When we looked through the lens, I was amazed at the colourfulness of nature and how we could see the organelles inside the cell. When we compared the onion cells with human cheek cells, we saw that they weren't that different at all. Basically, both types of cells were both membranes that contain important organelles, like nuclei and mitochondria. This showed us that when you get down to the level of a cell, we aren't that much different from species such as plants, bacteria and fungi.
The organisation of organisms start with similar cells which combine to make tissue. Different tissues then combine to make organs. Organs combine to make organ systems. And finally, these work together to keep an organism alive and healthy. Cells themselves are made up of organelles, which are the parts which make a cell function. As you have seen, the cells in a person and an animal are surprisingly similar. This is also the same with things like trees and plants. This tells us about how closely related we are to all life, whether you are a rat, a person, or a tree. All complex life shares the same organisation.
We studied the rainforest to see how species fit with their environment and as an important biome. The top layer is the emergent layer. The features is that the trees can reach to 60 metres in height. The middle layer is the canopy layer. The features for this layer is that the trees can go 20 to 30 metres in height. The middle layer is under canopy. The features is that plants receive 2 to 15% of available sunlight. The penultimate layer is shrub layer. The features for this are that plants get 1 to 2% of sunlight. And finally, the last layer is the forest floor. The features for this is that it decomposes organic matter and leaf litter found here.
As you heard, we began our rainforest studies by looking at the layers of the rainforest, which are dominated by the plants competing for life. The emergent layer is made up of the top of the tallest trees. Often these species have thick, waxy leaves, which helps prevent them from drying out in the sun. Many birds thrive in this layer. In the canopy layer of overlapping trees, flying animals can be found in some of our closest cousins, such as orangutans. The understory is very humid and damp down there. This is where many other climbing plants use the trees to scramble for light for photosynthesis. Insects are the dominant animal species here, with many fungi too. The forest floor is the darkest and the most humid layer. This is where the big land-based animals live, such as elephants, tigers, and humans, such as the Maya. The Maya people survived in the rainforest by cleverly building cities with streets on slopes to collect the rainfall. As many people do not realize, but the rainforests in what is now Mexico and Guatemala contains very few rivers. They also create reservoirs to clean water. They place lily pads in the water, which would thrive only if the water was clean. This allows them to tell if the water was drinkable or not drinkable. If the flower died, the water was not safe to drink. The ancient Mayan people's relationship with nature was very strong. From their writing, we know that they espoused that humans were one of the many parts of nature with
mutual responsibilities. From this, we can infer that they worked with nature instead of against it. Later in the expedition, we saw just how reliant on nature they were.
Just as the ancient Maya were inspired by nature, so is every other civilization in history, from prehistoric people painting on cave walls to the Maya to the Romantic poets. Over this first case study, we looked at a lot of poetry. One of them is called For Forest. This poem is about a forest, but written from the perspective where the forest was personified as a woman keeping secrets. It had a lot of anaphora, which is when phrases are repeated, such as the keeping of secrets, which emphasises how important it is that we look after the forest to keep our secrets too. The second poem I want to talk about is Over My Toes. This poem is about the ocean and how the ways that we affect it. It had a cyclical structure, like the waves. The length of the line could the shape of the waves, feeling, then seeing, feeling, then seeing. When the human author went away, the sea would still be there, just like nature would still be there without us.
When looking at the poem Wind, we saw that the poet Ted Hughes described the wind as quite destructive and reckless. Hughes uses the quote, "The wind trembles," showing that everything is so afraid they can't stand. He did this to personify the wind, making it overpower the entire area of the poem. The writer uses other poetic devices throughout the poem, such as onomatopoeia and oxymoron. Hughes talks about the wind as a strong army by using the word stampeding. This could link to our relationship with nature and how humans have damaged and interfered with the wild. It still, however, shows how vulnerable we are to nature. Overall, the wind is presented as undefeatable, which hints at the fact that no matter how much we damage nature, it will recover, but perhaps we will not.
Perhaps one of the reasons we are doing so much damage to nature is that in the modern world we spend less and less time in nature, enjoying it, appreciating it. We studied a text called The Lost Words. This is a book full of poems and illustrations that are made about nature. The writer, Robert Macfarlane, and the artist Jackie Morris wrote and illustrated these acrostic poems, or spells as the author calls them, because they are trying to show that since humans are spending less time in nature, some of these words and spells are being lost. The message in the poem is that nature works in mysterious ways that we will never understand, and without it, we won't have half of the things that we have been given. To appreciate this, we have to spend time in nature, to play conkers, to be in awe of the bullfinch. If we do this and feel part of and reconnect with nature, perhaps we'll be better stewards of the natural world.
To start our practice in digital watercolour, we used shades, tones and tints in an emerald on Adobe Fresco to represent light on one side of the gem. We then used Jackie Morris's owl eye and tried to copy her style. At first we did an outline, then we used dry mixes and wet mixes to show darker and lighter areas with strong outlines or blended mixes depending on what we saw in the model. We noticed that lighter colours were used as bases and there were build-up of colours on top of it. This information helped us because then we could understand Jackie Morris's techniques more and be able to use it on our own work later.
In answer to the question, what is the thing about nature that inspires us, is the species that nature homes. Many vital species of which we rely on grow in our natural landscapes. For example, 70% of ingredients needed for cancer treatment are located in the rainforest. Also, something that is inspiring is the many seasonal and annual cycles which take place in the natural world. Imagine a world without nature, a world without those species. Our lives would change drastically. People would suffer as they are denied the treatments they need. Nature might be affected by us, but we rely on nature completely. Without nature, we would not be where we are today.
If we think of humans as a separate part of nature, it can be dangerous and incorrect. This is because of food webs that connect all living things. Also, linking to this, we need each other to survive. If we were not a part of nature, we would not be able to survive as we rely on the natural world for both food and oxygen, which we need to survive. If we see ourselves as separate or somehow as in charge of nature, then we are less likely to care for and be stewards of the natural world. We need to spend time in nature to appreciate it for the gift of its beauty.
During case study 2, the nature of our relationship, we learned about our relationship with nature and just how reliant we are on it. An example of this is photosynthesis and how plants are able to make their own food and take nutrients from the soil, and how we can in turn make use of this energy and these nutrients too. We found that overall we are having a negative impact on biodiversity. To help us understand our relationship with nature, as an example of where this is going wrong, we looked at deforestation in the Amazon rainforest and the consequences it has had on the 4 different stakeholders: Amazonian tribes, the Brazilian government, cattle ranch farmers, and animal rights activists. Also, we saw how biodiversity loss can have a negative impact on ecosystems due to the interdependence of all species in an ecosystem, including us.
When thinking about how we are reliant on plants, as has been said, the most important chemical reaction is photosynthesis, which is how plants make their own food. During photosynthesis, energy transferred from sunlight is used to change carbon dioxide and water into glucose and oxygen. The glucose is important for other forms of life because it is an energy store, which means energy can be transferred from one individual to another. The oxygen is important because other species, including us, use it to carry out respiration. So you can say humans are entirely dependent on plants for an energy store to be able to use this energy and to build our biomass.
While species are interdependent, we also learned that they can be in competition with each other too. For example, we saw that for plants in the rainforest, they mainly compete for sunlight, carbon dioxide, and nutrients in the soil. Certain plants adapted towards this by growing outwards instead of growing upwards. The plant we observed was successful with this. Animals also showed competition by competing for natural resources. For example, water, food, and shelter are all key in an animal's life. These are the key 3 things that animals fight for. We also saw an example of communities of animals competing within the same species, where the 2 rival groups of chimpanzees were fighting for territory. Competition increases biodiversity if more species compete for the same resources. There are more parts of the web of interdependence. For example, if only one plant grows and outcompetes other plants, then only certain bugs would be able to eat from that one plant, and so only certain birds would be attracted to. If there is healthy competition between lots of species of plants, it attracts more types of insects, and so more different types of birds to eat that highly diverse population of bugs in that area, causing it to increase biodiversity.
I'm going to be talking about why plants are co-producers and what they can do but other animals cannot. Plants are co-producers because they create their own food using the energy transferred by sunlight. However, animals cannot do this. Animals need to eat other species. A food chain is a way of showing how species get their energy and their biomass. In other words, the stuff that they need to build their bodies. The arrows on the food chain show the flow of energy and the biomass. For example, when a badger eats a worm, energy and biomass are transferred from the worm to the badger. So there will be an arrow pointing to the badger from the worm.
Feeding relationships are never as simple as food chains, though, in a real ecosystem. A food web shows a number of different complex feeding relationships in a habitat or ecosystem. These food webs are often delicately balanced because the species are interdependent. For example, if the population density of a species in a food web decreases after an amount of time, their predator's population density might decrease due to a lack of food. It is not just the species that are in a single food chain that would be affected. All of them could. Think about it. If the prey of an animal goes down, then eventually the predator might die out. They would have no food.
Organisms are interdependent as all consumers have to get food for themselves, which means they have to hunt. It may be much easier for us as we can just go to the shop to get food, but that food has to come from somewhere. We are part of food webs and food chains in just the same way as all other species.
In Case Study 2, we looked at a chapter from our anchor text, A Life on Our Planet, by David Attenborough. This chapter was about the Serengeti, which is a grassland ecosystem and environment in Africa. People thought that the Serengeti was infinite. Its name means endless plains, and that there's practically no end to the amount of resources on Earth. We all know that this is incorrect, as when you go around the world, you'll find the same place again eventually. However, this view that nature could continue to provide forever led humans to exploit its resources because they thought it would never run out. This damages nature because we were and still are taking natural resources from our planet at a rate quicker than the resources can return. To look at a simple food chain in the Serengeti, we can look at grass and herbivores grazers such as wildebeest. It is clear that the wildebeest are relying on the grass as they need it for food. However, the grass also needs the herbivores because when a herbivore eats grass, it helps to regrow by clearing areas for younger plants to grow and leaving fertile dung with materials to enrich the soil, making the grass species more successful. So interdependence really does work both ways. We are relying on nature, but we also need to make sure we look after nature too, precisely because we need it so much.
The ancient Maya gave us a stark example of what can happen to civilizations when their relationship with nature is in balance. We learned that the Maya civilization had many great achievements, such as creating the concept of zero or nick, as well as the first calendar, the first rubber ball game, and also amazing reservoirs. We learned about evaluating sources and that, for example, an archaeological source is very reliable because it cannot lie, as it was there when this event took place. But in some ways, it might not be very helpful because these sources didn't always explain why something happened, when it happened, where it happened, or how it happened. We saw in one example a monument that was left unfinished at the time of the Maya city's collapse, with carvings and dates that just stopped. Nobody can be certain why the lowland Maya civilizations collapsed. It might have occurred because of the invasions between tribes, or perhaps a loss of belief in their kings. There is evidence of widespread drought at the time their cities were abandoned. Viewed as gods, if the kings could not make it rain, perhaps their people lost faith and rejected the kings in their cities.
Some scientists suggest that deforestation carried out by the Mayans when they were clearing land for farming might have actually caused the droughts. During this expedition, we were looking into deforestation and the causes and consequences. The causes of deforestation are cattle farming, population growth, roads, and logging. In Brazil, these causes are bringing the Amazon to the ground. Some cattle farmers are setting the forests on fire to clear room for the cows, and the government wants this to happen to make more money. However, tribal people are losing their way of life, and it's causing habitat loss, which is why activists are campaigning to stop it. One of the ways that we could understand what was going on was our class debate. We had a debate to discuss how the different stakeholders felt, and during this we needed to show empathy and put ourselves into other people's shoes. Two groups were talking about the opposite views of how trees are carbon stores, and more CO2 gets released into the air, and this leads to climate change on top of the biodiversity loss. The other group was talking about money and why that was important to the farmers to be able to earn a living. None of this is easy, but we do know that our overall impact on the planet is negative, and something needs to change.
In another extract from our anchor text, we saw how deforestation impacted on animal species. Orangutans are affected by deforestation because we are cutting down forests at mass levels for palm oil.
This destroys habitats and impacts biodiversity because when we chop down trees, animals' habitats get destroyed and biodiversity crumbles. Without a certain type or amount of animals, the delicate balance in an ecosystem gets disrupted. It is important that you know that palm oil can be found in products such as shampoo and conditioner. To help stop this problem, you can make sure that the things that you use do not contain palm oil.
In this case study, we have seen how we humans are reliant upon the natural world because we need resources that are located in the forest for things such as plants that can help with cancer, species that we are relying on for food, oxygen that the forests produce, or water that flows through these habitats. Sadly, this relationship can and is going wrong because the natural world is relying on us. For example, deforestation has taken animals' habitats. This is now a severe situation as these animals produce food for us and can help with many things. But in time, it will impact so badly on biodiversity that ecosystems will collapse, just as the Maya civilization did. We are also lowering biodiversity in important ecosystems such as the rainforest, which can have an impact on food chains and make them decline, and also leads to more greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. But we can recover from this by spreading message and acting upon this. The solution in part lies in rewilding our planet that's becoming a shadowland and learning about nature so people understand why it's so important we are stewards of nature and restore its natural beauty.
During our final case study 3, we imagined a world without us, and so in fact, without us, nature will be just fine. There may be a mass extinction happening, but in the past, nature has always recovered. It may just be that we end up being a part of the mass extinction too. We learn about what solutions we should consider to help nature and so help ourselves, rewilding, decreasing deforestation, regrowing, rebuilding, and burning fewer fossil fuels. We also learned from mistakes made involving damaging and vandalizing nature. Some other important things we learned about were how humans can and are acting for positive change. For example, through the conservation of species such as those on the Durham Priority Species List. We did this by exploring our local green corridor. We also spoke to an expert called Sophie Common, who is in charge of rewilding beavers in England. We wrote as scientists to inform others about our individual species. We also began writing a persuasive letter to our local MP to help improve our relationship with nature.
The term conservation refers to when humans make plans and act to preserve other species' natural ecosystems/habitats in hope that it will protect populations from decline. Areas of conservation are set aside as places we must allow to grow. Nature reserves can help protect species as it's a protected area so nobody can destroy any part of that land. Breeding programs in zoos can help species as they get properly looked after. Whilst some are in captivity, most programs involve the aim of increasing population number before rewilding.
Many species, such as the red kite, that have been or are endangered are on the protected species list. The purpose of the protected species list is to make people aware of what species we need to help. If they are on this list, organisations such as local government or wildlife trusts have to do something about it. For example, for birds, there are 3 parts of the priority list: red list, amber list and the green list. The green list is where the species aren't anywhere near endangerment. Amber list is a risk, however, it's not as concerning as the red list, which is the most concerning and the closest to extinction. The amber list includes ruddy turnstones. The red list includes willow tit. All of these species have action plans which protect their habitats.
Jackie Morris inspired our watercolour artwork. She painted nature her way. By that, I mean she painted animals the way she pictures it inside her head. That's why we used Adobe Fresco to paint her style. And we had to learn how to use real-life watercolours to do our final product. All the watercolour painting was of our chosen species. We were assigned a species and had to write, paint and illustrate it.
During case study 3, the artist that inspired us with our watercolour work was Jackie Morris.
The fact that her work is all natural defines her talent as it puts an inspiring message out into the world and shows the beauty of nature. To practice our artwork and mimicking her style, we did it digitally on an app called Adobe Fresco. It gave us an idea of how to use watercolours on paper in a way which made mistakes more forgiving before we went to our final watercolour work.
To prepare us for our final product, we learned multiple watercolour mixing techniques. These techniques were wet on wet paint mix, dry on wet paint mix, and wet on dry paint mix. We also learned techniques for different brushes, such as different sizes and round versus flat techniques. Then we learned colour techniques. These techniques were tone, shade and tint. Tones were achieved by mixing grey with hues to achieve a softer, more pastel colour. Shades are achieved by mixing black with hues to get low lights. And finally, highlights are made from tints where white is mixed with a hue.
Many of the species that we were illustrating can be found in our local green corridors. Green corridors are the places in the community where no building is allowed and animals can live without much human interference. We are still allowed to walk around or play in the area, but we cannot harm or capture the animals there. Green corridors have a large span across an area of land. Example, the Windy Nook Nature Reserve. If we wanted to build on these green corridors, then there are things like laws and programs to stop us. Animals can be endangered if we harm their homes. This is why we have green corridors, which allow species to move between build-up areas in our region and are designed to help maintain biodiversity. Our local nature reserve is Windy Nook Nature Park. This park has many different habitats, home to many different animals, such as foxes, rabbits, frogs, and birds. The habitats found here are scrub, which is great for species that like to hide, such as foxes, rabbits, and birds. But there are also water habitats for species like frogs. When we carried out fieldwork at Windy Nook, we worked with an expert that was called Les. Les was a part of the Friends of Windy Nook Nature Reserve. He worked with the planners from the local government in charge of looking after the green corridor. We went out with him to collect soil samples to test the ground for its nutritional value for plants and herbivores.
During fieldwork, we carried out an ecology study along a transit line using tools called quadrats. These are squares that you place on the ground to help you to take samples of species in an area. Firstly, we counted the number of different species in the quadrat as a measure of biodiversity. Then we estimated the percentage of the quadrat was bare ground so that we knew how much of the quadrat each species covered. We learned that some species, like clovers, had adapted to live in infertile soil. This is why clovers, along with other plants, live here, as fewer plants can live in the unrestored area, so there is less competition for them.
Rewilding, a marvellous thing, but a thing we don't do enough. To rewild is to restore places to their natural state, free from human influence. There are 3 types. Ecological rewilding involves nature repairing itself. In Chernobyl, humans haven't inhabited the area, so wildlife has reclaimed land. Bears have been seen for the first time in a century, and the number of wolves has increased 7-fold. Trophic rewilding is when humans reintroduce apex predators into places where their numbers have decreased. This helps the ecosystem to restore balance. In Yellowstone National Park, wolves have been reintroduced, which has allowed many species to flourish. We saw evidence of the impact of this trophic rewilding in our crew read 14 wolves. Elk population decreased, which meant that other species, such as beavers, were able to flourish. Pleistocene rewilding is the idea of reintroducing megafauna like elephants and lions to places where they once lived, or where similar, now extinct species used to live. But this is more controversial, with more doubt in the scientific community around whether it would help with biodiversity.
Sophie Common is an expert in rewilding. She and her team rewild species. Sophie's current role is bringing back and restoring populations of animals and birds to the UK, such as beavers and red kites. There are 3 steps they go through. Firstly, they bring some individuals to the UK. Next, they put them in an enclosure and monitor them to see if they are able to thrive in the environment. Finally, if they breed successfully, they get released into the wild, but the individuals will still be closely monitored. The red kite is a success story in the UK. Their population has increased by more than 1,000% in the last 20 years, which just shows the great work that people like Sophie can do.
Members of the public can help too. In order to help stop the loss of biodiversity in England, we are writing a formal, persuasive letter to our local MP. Some of the features of the formal and persuasive writing is your techniques. For example, rhetorical questions like, do you want this to happen to you and your kids? Since it is a formal letter, we can use contractions, and it's often written to get something that you want. We are writing it to our MP to argue for them to be able to make some more rewilding projects and more protected spaces, because if we continue how we are now, there may be a collapse in natural wildlife. The biggest problem is that if a species goes extinct in a certain area, all food chains the animal is involved in could collapse. A sentence from my writing that I like is, many believe that it's the younger generation that will fix it. However, do we really want them to grow up in a wasteland of scarce food and water with no shade and no wildlife?
There are many ways we can fix our relationship with nature. Firstly, we can try and rewild. Rewilding is a way we can bring back species to areas where they were extinct. This would help nature by increasing biodiversity. Also, we can stop building as many houses in order to protect animal habitats, reducing their extinction rate. This leads to food chains rebalancing, which links to rewilding again. Finally, we can reduce our use of products containing palm oil. If we do these, we can remember that we are part of nature again, not against it.
Coming back to Pripyat, we looked at how nature reclaimed it after humans abandoned it. In the vast areas of the land that were evacuated, we can now see the vast ecological rewilding. For instance, plants and birds have taken over the city. In an excerpt of a book we read called Islands of Abandonment, we learned that plants had overgrown in buildings, birds used old drawers for nests, and moss had covered the walls. This teaches us that nature doesn't need us, and that nature will be just fine on its own, and if we give it a chance, it can repair our mistakes. It is ourselves we need to save.
As humans, we think of ourselves separate from nature, but really we are all the same. Plants, animals, and humans are all made from cells. Our relationship with nature is poor. Over the years, people have destroyed ecosystems and taken nature for granted. For humans to survive, we have to improve our relationship with nature and work with it, not against it. We are reliant on nature because we need oxygen, which trees make, and we need animals for food. This is called interdependence. When people talk about saving the planet, we really mean saving ourselves. Whilst many species will go extinct, plants and nature overall will be okay and will survive. It always does, but we won't.
So we come to our final product, which is about raising awareness of protected species and encouraging our community to go out and enjoy our wild spaces. In our final product, we've produced a piece of scientific writing for each species, which we looked at. For this, we looked at their habitat, their adaptations, their interdependence, their conservation status, and finally, we include the section dedicated to how we can help these important species. Adaptations means any features an organism has that can help it have an advantage in competition to survive and reproduce in its environment. Interdependence means multiple species relying on each other through complex relationships. Finally, a habitat is the natural home or environment of an organism. Understanding these things about a species helps us to understand how to protect them.
Excellent. As part of our final product, we wrote poems about species from the priority list in Durham. These species are endangered. We wanted to show the negative impact we as humans have on these species. During this, we were learning how to use different poetic devices to improve our writing, such as repetition, emotive language, and careful choice of verbs. As I creep carefully along the bottom of the murky pond, dodging plastic bottles and cold, sharp edges of cans hiding under leaves, my tail just missing the point of a can trying to reach my eggs. Above me, playful, multicoloured frogs hop gracefully, carefree from lily pad to lily pad. Luckily, I can see my eggs. Then out of nowhere, disturbing the peace of the pond, a giant hand takes my eggs, snatching them, handful after handful.
The hand sends ripples through the water, forcing me up against the rusted shard of a tin can. I feel the cold metal on my back as I watch. I can only save 3 of my eggs. I feel like it's all my fault. I huddle my eggs in my long orange smooth tail, praying my kids will come back home, come back to me.
Critique helps because it helps us know what to improve. For example, a piece of critique I received is to add more information about how and where they make their houses. We have learned more information about our species by writing from their perspective. Elevating blades of grass towering like a crane over me as I'm avoiding them daily. Above me a bird sways, I hallucinate. Squidgy swampy fields surround me. Running away from them. I build my nest in elongated thick grasses to protect me from the rain and wind. Thud, thud, thud. They are all serrated Baltic, too fierce for my liking. Overwhelmed, I bury myself into the nest, a safety net. The EU camouflage into the grass for the sake of my safety. I move silently beneath the cover of darkness into my safe nest. If only they knew I was harmless, they might begin to understand.
As you have heard, our STEAM final product was an animal fact file focusing on green corridor species. We first researched an animal, as you have heard, finding out about their habitat, adaptations, interdependence, and conservation status. Then we did the first draft. After that, we got teacher, critique, and started redrafting. The importance of the habitat section was to inform people on where they live and what not to destroy. The adaptation told the reader how amazing that species was and how they feed, compete, and survive. The interdependence told us how they depend on other species throughout the food chain. Finally, the conservation status told us if that animal was at any risk or endangered. This piece of writing had to be very formal but informative, and it all had to be the facts. This was different to other tasks as we had to link it to past learning and we had to choose verbs carefully to indicate what the animal does. Our writing was scientific, so we used technical language and were direct, which was a big contrast to our poems.
In arts, for our final product, after drafting our illustrations in the app Adobe Fresco, we started to have an idea of what it is like to paint with watercolors before doing it on paper. Some challenges when we wanted to transfer the painting to paper was that we only had one chance, and to show craftsmanship and quality, we would redraft them more often. We learned several new techniques, like how to get the illusion of 3D form when we used wet and dry mix depending on what we wanted our colour and texture to look like.
We have all been writing poems about some of the endangered species in Britain, and all of these species and poems will be getting a place on the website. This website is getting uploaded because we want to inform people of the danger all of these beautiful species are in because of us. Here at XPG, we have been learning all about these species, which all on the priority list and are endangered. We feel like it is important to raise awareness to our community about these species. The more we raise awareness, it will become more clear to the community in the future. Our website also contains a geocaching route with clues which will lead you through our beautiful green space.
On our crew day together, we carried out geocaching to explore the green corridor around our school. We've enjoyed this so much that we have put together a set of clues and geocaches for families in our community to follow and explore our green corridor too. This is because we want you to develop a love of nature. If more people spend more time in nature, then we think you'll be more likely to want to look after nature just like we do, and to improve our relationship with the natural world. Because when we talk about saving the planet, as you have seen, we really mean saving ourselves.
This has been our presentation of learning for the expedition What a Wonderful World, where students have attempted to answer the question, what is our relationship with the natural world? The presentation of learning has been an opportunity for our students to talk through their learning during this expedition. As part of this expedition, students will also be creating a final product. This is a website which will contain poetry, scientific writing and artwork about the species in our local area which are endangered. A section of our website will have geocaching routes which start at our school and will take you via clues on a number of walks around our local green space. This represents activism on the part of our students as they want to involve their families and others in the community to experience and value and protect our local green corridor and the species that live there. Finally, can I wish all of our parents and guardians a fantastic summer holiday and take this opportunity to thank you for all of your support throughout the year.